What if the most valuable maps left by ancient civilizations were not carved in stone or traced on papyrus, but written subtly inside human bodies and remembered as a kind of inner geography? What if modern science, by privileging external artifacts and measurable data, has often overlooked systems of knowledge designed to be verified from within? Today we follow that possibility, using one powerful case as our compass: the discovery of Gnostic texts at Nag Hammadi and a persistent claim within them about embodied signs of origin. If this idea sparks anything in you, type a single word in the comments, recognition, and hold that feeling for the rest of the video. In December 1945, a clay jar buried near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt was opened, and a library of texts emerged that had been hidden for centuries. These are non-canonical writings, Gnostic scriptures and sayings, rituals and hymns, distinct from the books that became the Christian New Testament. Among these documents is the so-called Gospel of Philip and other texts that record a worldview in which human beings carry within themselves an imprint of a transcendent source. Scholars such as James M. Robinson and Elaine Pagels have worked to make these writings accessible and understandable. They are contested, fragmentary, and often elliptical, yet they opened a door to practices and ideas that had been marginalized during the later consolidation of orthodoxy. We must be careful at the outset. These are non-canonical texts, preserved and valued by certain early communities, not universally accepted scripture. The claims they contain are theological and experiential, not medical or scientific facts. Still, the texts report a kind of inner technology, rituals, markers, and methods of verification that practitioners use to test spiritual claims. When we ask why mainstream science and institutional religion have largely ignored those claims, the answer is not simply malice or conspiracy. It is also a matter of method, evidence, and institutional priorities. Archaeology favors objects. Science favors reproducible measurement. Institutions favored certain texts over others. The result is a gap between external evidence and living, subjective know-how. Within the Gnostic frame, the cosmos is explained in a particular sequence of ideas. At the top is the monad, the ineffable source, the undivided one, from which all things trace their origin. From the monad, through stages of emanation, fragments of the divine become enfolded in matter. A lesser creator, often called the demiurge, fashions the visible world, and, according to these accounts, obscures the soul's remembrance of its origin. Between the demiurge and human perception stand the archontes, interfering intelligences or structural forces that limit awareness. These terms are theological rather than scientific. They map a metaphysical hypothesis that ancient communities used to explain alienation, forgetting, and the possibility of return. But the texts do not leave their ideas purely abstract. They often describe practices aimed at awakening an inner memory, anamnesis, so that the soul recognizes its origin and asserts a different relation to the world. One of the more striking claims recorded in some of these traditions is the existence of 3 bodily marks, or loci, that function as experiential checkpoints: an origin point at the base of the skull, a perception-related marker toward the lateral edge of the hand, and a command or center at the chest. These are described not as anatomical charts in the modern medical sense, but as ritualized points of contact through which a person might feel an inner confirmation of their spiritual lineage. If we pause here, a lot of questions and skepticism naturally rise. Are these marks literal? Do they correspond to fixed anatomical features? The responsible answer is no. The texts and traditions present them as symbolic phenomenological markers, places where attention has historically been directed during rites of recognition. They are reported to produce subjective sensations in those who practice the rites. They are not reported as measurable anatomical constants subjected to clinical trials. That distinction is crucial. What we are exploring is an ancient way of knowing that privileges lived experience and interior verification over external proof. But there's more. The texts also outline simple practices, forms of touching, attentional focus, or ritual gestures that functioned as tests. Because many of you will be curious, and because the idea of verification lies at the heart of this claim, I will describe the contours of that practice. Before that, a clear disclaimer. What follows is a phenomenological description drawn from texts and from later practitioners' reports. It is not medical advice, it is not a guaranteed technique, and it does not promise physical healing, supernatural power, or any specific outcome. If you choose to explore this as a contemplative exercise, treat it as optional, reflective, and private. Imagine a simple, quiet setup. You sit comfortably, eyes soft, breath steady. The practice begins as an inward turning. The first locus, described as a point of origin, is said to be felt toward the back of the head, around the base of the skull. Practitioners report a subtle sense there, a pressure, a warmth, or a sense of anchor. The second locus, connected to perception, is associated with the lateral side of the hand, where touch first meets the world. When attention moves there, people describe an opening in sensation, a widening that feels less like thinking and more like registering. The third locus, the center of command, is experienced around the chest, an openness or firmness that feels like decision, a settled affirmation. Taken one at a time, each mark becomes a checkpoint. Is there a small sense of origin when the back of the head is attended to? Does the hand's lateral edge give a different tone to how you receive stimuli? Does the chest settle when you allow a quiet, intentional command to arise? Those who recorded these practices framed them as tests of remembrance. If the person recognized their origin, these markers would present as evidence, not as proof to an external observer, but as internal affirmation. This is an embodied epistemology, knowledge validated by felt recognition. Some will say this is purely psychological and can be explained in modern terms: placebo, suggestion, focused attention altering interoception. That is a legitimate reading. Others will feel an actual qualitative difference and interpret it in spiritual terms. The ancient point was not to make empirical claims to scientists, but to allow the seeker a way to know for themselves. The value of such a method is that it bypasses authority, whether ecclesial or academic, and returns the question of truth to lived experience. Skepticism is not only reasonable, it is a necessary part of the process. The texts themselves anticipate resistance. They speak of clouded memory, of internal voices that sow doubt, the kind of self-critical chatter that we all know when we try something new. In the Gnostic frame, these are sometimes personified as archontes, but in psychological language, they are familiar patterns of thought: disbelief, self-sabotage, worry. A practical suggestion from the tradition, and one entirely compatible with contemporary mindfulness practices, is to observe these doubting voices without engaging. Notice the thoughts. Name them. Let them pass. The test is less about silencing doubt and more about noticing whether a different kind of recognition appears beneath it. Now, why does modern science largely ignore claims like these? There are several interlocking reasons, and none of them require grand conspiracies. First, the methods of science privilege repeatability and external measurement. A subjective sensation that cannot be independently recorded or reliably reproduced in a laboratory setting falls outside mainstream experimental protocols. Second, preservation bias in the archaeological record favors durable artifacts, stone, clay, durable manuscripts, over lived practices that relied on oral transmission and embodied memory. Rituals transmitted from person to person leave little to excavate. Third, disciplinary silos and institutional priorities have historically guided what is studied and who gets funded. Religious institutions that canonized certain texts also shape the categories of what counts as authoritative spiritual knowledge. There is also a historical process to consider. During the formation of many religious canons, choices were made. Some communities' texts were preserved and others marginalized. That consolidation is not simply the result of intellectual discernment. It emerged in particular power contexts, with politics, geography, and theology all playing roles. Non-canonical texts survived in smaller circles, sometimes in secret, sometimes in monastic or hermetic communities. When rediscovered, like the Nag Hammadi corpus, they often appear odd, syncretic, or elusive to scholars trained in other paradigms. Yet marginalization by institutions does not automatically equal falsehood. It reveals different epistemic commitments. Modern archaeology, anthropology, and cognitive science can illuminate aspects of these phenomena. We can trace how practices change, how ideas migrate, how communities form. But the embodied verification claimed in these traditions belongs to a domain that resists being reduced to objects on a shelf. It is practice as knowledge. We can broaden our lens without proving universal equivalence. Across ancient cultures, there are numerous examples of inner practices, initiation rites, breath techniques, mnemonic devices, meant to orient a person toward a perceived source. Egyptian initiation rituals emphasized rebirth and alignment with cosmic order. Vedic traditions in South Asia developed complex techniques of inner attention and mantra to recall a higher self. Taoist meditational systems cultivated an internal map of ki and energetic centers. These analogies are not archaeological proofs that a single, unified inner technology was shared everywhere, but they do suggest a recurring human pattern. Civilizations created methods for knowing something interiorly that they could not always transmit as external evidence. That pattern has social consequences. A person who claims an inner verification that differs from local norms can face isolation. In some contexts, communities formed precisely to sustain those practices. Circles of seekers, small bands of initiates, marginal religious houses. Reclaiming spiritual autonomy, learning to trust one's felt recognition rather than institutional endorsement, has always been both liberating and costly. It can free a person from dependence on external authorities, but it can also drive them toward communities that prize secrecy and liturgical exactness. So how do we balance curiosity with caution? First, by remaining clear about domains. Subjective experience and empirical measurement are different ways of knowing. Both have strengths. Second, by respecting the non-canonical status of the sources we explore while also acknowledging their historical value and the lived practices they preserve. Third, by refusing to indulge simplistic narratives that portray science as villain and tradition as victim. The truth is messier. Science is method. Tradition is memory. They can talk to each other if we translate carefully. At this point, some of you may be asking, is there any way for modern researchers to engage with these claims responsibly? The answer is yes, but it requires interdisciplinary humility. Ethnographers and historians of religion can document practices and testimonies. Cognitive scientists can investigate phenomenology, how attention shifts, how interoception changes with training. Archaeologists can seek out contextual evidence of ritual spaces and paraphernalia that suggest embodied practices. Together, these approaches can create a fuller picture without forcing subjective phenomena into the straitjacket of purely external validation. What does the secret finally amount to? It is not a single hidden fact that, once revealed, overturns whole fields. It is a form of knowledge preserved within certain ancient traditions, an embodied, experiential pathway to a remembered source. Modern science does not treat such knowledge as primary because it asks different questions. But for seekers, the secret is valuable precisely because it is testable from within. It invites a person to recover a type of memory, anamnesis, by which one recognizes one's own origin, not because an external authority declares it so, but because one feels it. We live in a time when reclaiming inner authority matters. For spiritual seekers, that means learning to differentiate between inner sensations that are informative and those that are mere suggestion or wishful thinking. It means cultivating practices that strengthen discernment, slow attention, repeated observation, community testimony. For scholars, it means acknowledging the limitations of evidence without dismissing the richness of lived traditions. For communities, it means creating spaces where curiosity and critical thinking coexist. Before we close, let me return to practical care. If you found the description of the 3 markers intriguing and want to explore privately, do so gently. Treat any exercise as a contemplative experiment, time-limited, non-invasive, and confidential. Notice sensations without demanding results. If emotions arise, give them attention or seek a supportive conversation. If at any point you feel distress, stop and consult a qualified professional. Remember, no internal experience is a guarantee. It is a datum to be weighed alongside reason, community, and ethical judgment. In the next episode, we will examine cross-cultural parallels more closely and look at the archaeological and textual evidence that might illuminate how ancient civilizations preserved inner knowledge systems. We will consult translations of the Nag Hammadi library, read critical work by Elaine Pagels and James M. Robinson, and talk to scholars working at the intersection of cognitive science and religious history. I want to keep this conversation responsible and generative. We will treat claims as claims, documents as documents, and experiences as experiences. For now, take a moment. If this material touched something in you, however subtle, type one word in the comments: recognition. Let that single word create a small, quiet signal that you felt a resonance. Share it not because the word proves anything to others, but because it marks a willingness to attend to what lies within. If you want to continue this inquiry, subscribe and join us for the next episode, where we will map parallels across cultures and examine where scholarship and lived tradition meet. In the description, you'll find suggested readings and translations, including the Nag Hammadi Library and accessible work by Pagels and Robinson. Thank you for listening closely. The secret of ancient civilizations is not solely in stones and archives. It lives in methods of remembering. Our task is not to reclaim a lost artifact, but to learn a careful way of discerning what that inner map might mean for us today.